Olafur, to begin with the beginning, I was very curious to know how it all started. What was your epiphany? How did you get into art?
Well, my father was an artist and I was very busy impressing him. So I got somewhat too obsessed with becoming an artist before I was ever even aware of the consequences of being an artist. So I never actually questioned, or I never had an alternative. For a brief period I sort of in my puberty had this other period of wanting to be a dancer, but besides that I really grew into it.
And where would you say were your inspirations? Who are your heroes in art?
I grew up with a lot of more conventional, painter friends of my family, which took me on their journeys into nature, painting on a staffeli and so on and so forth. So when I was somewhat running around and playing, my father and his friends, they would be, painting. In a sense, they would be my first heroes. I later got involved with, I went to art school, and quite soon after that I discovered the sort of East American artists, like West American artists, I'm sorry, like the West Coast light and space people like James Turrell and Robert Irwin and these people, and they became very important for me with regards to how one, in a sort of performative way would introduce thinking or theory into, very dematerialized work. So I found something which I found very interesting in terms of it being not, let's say, not formal and yet incredibly minimal.
And where would you say did your first work happen, which wasn't student work, sort of the catalogue raisonné? Where would your catalogue raisonné start? Because I think that's related also to the epiphany.
I always thought of my early works as a long story, and I would normally not block them into like units. I don't know exactly when I became particularly successful. I sadly, as it might sound, I didn't have that one situation where I said, "Wow, this was the right choice," or something like that. I was in school at a time where there was no market. There was the art object had disappeared. There was no reason really to make art besides actually working with content. There was no exhibitions. There was a very creative time with regards to what can art fundamentally also even be. And therefore the group of friends I was hanging out with, we didn't actually do much. And this period of doing nothing became very important because it was essentially not nothing, but it was a sort of state of dematerialization. And we looked obviously a lot into the works of the 70s, the activist work, the work of the 60s, but generally speaking, we never made a statement with regards to this is it. We said maybe this is a part of a bigger flow, and this became quite important. This was, as you can hear, this is very typical 90s, and I guess I would normally see myself as a pretty sort of mainstream 90s sort of development in that sense.
And where did then architecture enter? Because we've done many interviews before, but we thought today it could be interesting to focus on the sort of whole relation to architecture, your collaborations with architecture, your own architecture, the sort of whole links to the architecture. Well, when did this happen for the first time?
Well, very early on, I got involved with perception and different ideas of psychology or sort of psychophysical questions, and to what extent one can use the senses in some more spatial ways. Can one constitute a space based on the sort of ways that the senses work? So, the Gestalt psychology became important quite early on, and suddenly I realized that I was developing a kind of a toolbox which raised a lot of spatial questions that other people were also dealing with. Among those were, for instance, architects. Architects, they would come to these kind of questions from a more, let's say, a more planning point of view. They would address, let's say, not necessarily a master plan, but they would plan on behalf of people. And I would work coming from, I wouldn't call it psychology, but I don't know what to call it right now, but I would plan, based on a more singular perception of a situation. So from a quite different point of view, I was, in a sense, able quite early on to address a spatial challenge that normally an architect would deal with, and I would address it. I mean, the way I see it, I would address it in different ways, not based on a master plan, but based on the idea of what does an individual role, what is the role of the individual within something plural. So I did think of a plurality, but I worked much more with, well, what does it mean when you experience something, and what consequences does this have for your sense of collectivity?
I'll ask you a second and last time the question about heroes, and this time about architecture. Who were your heroes in architecture? One of the things we're interested with these interviews is sort of to also find out pioneers and maybe protest against forgetting. And it was very interesting how often Shinohara was mentioned, Lina Bobardi was mentioned in the context of this Biennale. But who were your heroes in architecture?
Well, I was very interested in architects who had a stronger sense of temporality. And who would that be? I mean, obviously history have canonized architects who are more obsessed with solidifying things. Obviously I was interested in people who are more interested in liquidifying. And the funny thing is that history has a way of solidifying states of liquidity even, and this is why I think I'm, with regards to, I've looked a lot to sort of early sort of architecture from India, wells, building of cloaking systems, wells, solar instruments. I worked with industrial, engineering, architectural principles of doing astrophysical instruments and solar panel, the very large array. And the big heroes for me, especially early on, were really engineers who made giant instruments to, let's say, predict space, or to kind of render cosmological questions, really. I never had my, I never had my sort of Mies thing. Obviously I participated in the discussion whether Mies is a temporal idea rather than a sort of a central point in a perspective, and I would always argue for the Bergsonian idea of Mies is a relationship and so on and so forth, but I would never say that, well, Mies is my big hero kind of thing. I would say temporality and the criticality that you can imply by introducing duration into a space in many different ways. That's been my hero, and what I mean, the Eiffel Tower, I love it. I think that's a great piece of architecture.